Hi, I'm Ed. Welcome to Common Sense.
And I'm John. How are you doing, Ed?
I'm good, John. How about yourself?
Doing well. Excited for the postseason in baseball. Of course, you and I might be knocking heads here pretty soon.
Well, one thing I think is for certain, it doesn't look like the Yankees are going to be going to Houston.
I don't. Yeah. I mean, they're a good team, but I think Boston has the most of the good players this year, at least in that division. So we'll see. So today's discussion, we thought we'd talk about the Adobe buyout of Marketo, which happened fairly recently. If you haven't heard about that, Adobe bought Marketo, the competitor to HubSpot in the marketing automation space, for $4.75 billion. So that's a nice chunk of change for the private equity group that bought Marketo a few years back for, I think it was $1.8 billion. But I guess the question we all have is, what's in it for us? What's in it for marketers? And how will this merger change the playing field among MarTech players like HubSpot and others, and even some of the smaller players that are trying to get into the space? So the question is, who will win in the different market segments for MarTech? Why don't you get us started on that, Ed?
Yeah, so, I mean, if you've watched our Common Sense videos or listened to the podcast or read the book Common Sense Revenue Growth, you've heard John and I repeatedly refer to the fact that we've got an affiliation, a longstanding affiliation with HubSpot as HubSpot partners over the years. But, you know, it's not an exclusive sort of a thing. It doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to other products. It doesn't mean we don't have clients that use other tools, et cetera. And so kind of with a few basic facts, maybe that's the place to start to kind of set the stage for the discussion. So who is Marketo? They've been really, I would say, HubSpot's primary competitor, at least in the middle market, B2B marketing automation kind of lead management space for about 10 years. Marketo has, I think, by all accounts, been more successful selling upstream to enterprise level companies, and they probably compete against Oracle's Eloqua in that space. And on the other hand, HubSpot has done a really good job selling kind of downstream to small and lower middle market companies where they've got a very different set of competitors. I think it's reasonable to say that neither of them have a huge footprint in the B2C space, and Adobe kind of, certainly at the enterprise level, has been really dominant in that space with the advertising cloud and the analytics cloud and all the tools that they've built around that. If you look at CRM and Salesforce automation, you know, certainly Salesforce is the 800-pound gorilla, as people say. Their acquisition of Pardot and kind of folding that into the same tool set means that Pardot is often a default answer for people that have Salesforce contracts. But when you sell head-to-head against the tools, typically HubSpot, you know, has a pretty easy time beating Pardot and is very successful on its own with its own CRM and Salesforce automation products that really are kind of a simple and appropriate answer for lower middle market and small businesses, where Salesforce works very effectively with large enterprises. So I would say, you know, there's no clear winner. There's no company that just has this dominant position. There's still very vibrant competition, although obviously it depends on which segment of the market you're talking about. So with that background, what's your analysis as the MarTech whisperer? I mean, why did Adobe buy Marketo?
Well, I'd be a rich man as a successful financial analyst if I knew the whole answer to that. But some obvious things do come to mind. As you mentioned, Adobe was strong in B2C, but surprisingly weak in B2B. So combining those market segments, really buying out another market, was a no-brainer. Second, there's some surprising things that I didn't realize. Adobe earlier this year bought Magento, which is a leading e-commerce solution. And so that means they're adding a robust B2B marketing platform on top of one of the best-known e-commerce platforms, and that seems to make a lot of sense. And then added to that, they also bought Visible, which allows them to offer omnichannel multi-touch attribution to the marketing stack. And that's kind of a unique play. And then more recently, Marketo is working with Google, the Google Cloud in specific, to develop AI apps for marketing. So there's a lot of room for future development. And then a little less obvious, but also interesting, is that Adobe, Microsoft, and SAP announced an open data initiative earlier this year. So maybe there's more integration coming along the lines of Adobe for B2C marketing, Marketo for B2B marketing, Microsoft Dynamics 365 for CRM, Magento for e-commerce, and SAP for back-end systems. So I think something like this has to be the end game, although the actual partnerships and connections still appear to be fluid right now. And then you ask, what will Salesforce do next? Do they get bought out by Adobe or Microsoft, or do they stay independent and maybe they buy HubSpot or Shopify, and try to compete in that sort of multi-functional platform space? And then, adding more apps later for advertising and back-end integration. So I think coming up next year in 2019 will be really a very interesting year for consolidation in MarTech, as this one has been. So that's kind of where we are right now at a high level. How do you think that impacts companies and users?
So, it's early. It's early to know exactly what Adobe and Marketo are going to do. You raised some interesting points about some of the kind of signals out there that you might cobble together and create a picture of what might be going to happen. And while we're both familiar with Marketo and Adobe, neither of us are, deeply embedded in those user communities. And so we don't know exactly what people are talking about or thinking there. There's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, as you're talking about those software packages, it strikes me that the biggest problem all of these companies have is churn, because it's the software itself is just a tool, and without understanding how to implement it as far as the business goes, it's of little value. And so cobbling together more tools is of still little value unless people know how to integrate them. So that becomes, I think, a big challenge no matter how big the business is. You mentioned to me a stat at one point about Invoca's VP of marketing, or not a stat, but the VP of marketing in Invoca said that with this acquisition, Adobe becomes the most comprehensive cloud for marketers, and thanks to their depth of creative design and analytic solutions combined with complete digital advertising tools. And that's great from telling the story to investors, but what does it mean to actual end users? What does it mean to creating more revenue for a company? Another perspective, an app that we both know from the HubSpot kind of partner world, CallRail, CMO there says that every day we engage with thousands of marketers who are urgently seeking to better measure and understand each and every digital touch point. Among other improvements, it wouldn't be surprising to see Adobe invest into this particular aspect of Marketo's product, so users can not only automate and report on their marketing, but also better understand how individual channels and campaigns are performing. In other words, substantial improvement in attribution, which has remained a real challenge in B2B, and which, as you pointed out earlier, is something that Adobe has excelled at in B2C. So that's kind of an interesting perspective. CallRail, just for context, is software that helps companies track inbound call leads, which often are generated by a website but manifest as a phone call, and so it helps with that attribution piece. So it seems, if we had to guess, that what Adobe's going for is probably broader reach across sales and marketing functions at a level that's both desirable, or that's appropriate for both B2C and B2B, across middle market and enterprises, and that's certainly something that HubSpot can't touch, and many other companies can't touch, and probably never will. Having said that, though, I don't see the merger affecting many of the small and lower middle market B2B companies that are using the software. The sophisticated attribution analysis isn't something that people are worried about when they're still talking about, demand gen, building lead gen. What's the right sales process? How do you get marketing and sales alignment? Those are much more fundamental building blocks. And the budgets for MarTech are still much lower typically in B2B, particularly in the industrial space, than in B2C. And
Sure.
So, there's a lot of companies, a lot of agencies that I see use HubSpot that don't even have Adobe Creative Cloud licenses. So I think that it's easy to assume that there's this enormous synergy that changes things, but I think it's probably a ways before it actually happens. However, this certainly does echo the themes that we focus on in Common Sense about the consolidation of this revenue growth continuum, how marketing and sales kind of begin to merge together. And it obviously puts Scott Brinker's graphic in the light that people have been predicting. It's just this out of control expansion that's going to have to begin to gradually contract and condense, and through mergers and through failures. But I think it's an important point to keep in mind. It's actually starting to happen. Do you agree?
I do, and I like the point you make about just the differences between needs and budgets and things like that among the different market segments. I mean, an enterprise, in either B2C or B2B, has way different needs and different levels of expertise and backup systems and all kinds of things that a smaller company just doesn't have and really can't support the weight of a big platform like this.
Right.
So that makes perfect sense. I do think I thought that, a lot of agencies I know, including my former agency, they do use the Adobe Creative Suite to do all the kind of the design work for websites and all the other marketing that they do. So it might be an interesting opportunity if somehow Adobe and Marketo and some of these other players figured out a nice way of tightly integrating that with CMSs and content marketing platforms, although none of those have been mentioned here. But that might be an interesting way of making it easier to go from the creative side straight into the marketing side, which hasn't really existed before.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a possibility, but you know how these things go. It'll probably take years to really sort out the existing merger and who's going to do what and which things are going away and all that sort of stuff. So I don't think HubSpot or anyone else is really should be sweating right now. What do you think?
No, I agree. And I think the perspective that we're primarily worried about isn't whether HubSpot would be worried, and it isn't whether any of the other SaaS companies would be worried. It's, more should end users be worried. If I'm running a $50 million industrial manufacturing company and I'm thinking it's time for us to get into digital marketing and we're evaluating tools, should this merger play a role in that decision? Should I be worried about consolidation and what the potential risks are as I look at MarTech stack decisions? I think it's a fair and it's a reasonable question to ask. What we've seen, and I believe as some of these transactions have happened, is that the acquired company continues to operate largely as an entity, and the agreements they have in place where people are, they're contracted for certain kinds of product and features at certain prices for an ongoing period. I mean, those continue and they're able to continue to use it. So it's really, if you become a new subscriber to Salesforce and you want to use Pardot, you get locked up in a very long, very constraining sort of an agreement. But if you are using a tool and Salesforce buys it, you can continue to use it and you're pretty much okay. So I think that, my gut feeling is it doesn't change it much. If you're a company that's looking at software to buy to facilitate your marketing automation, I would look I would be less concerned about the potential for a merger or acquisition than I would be about whether the runway is long enough. There's a lot of companies with neat ideas that get some funding, build a product, kind of go into the market, but are they going to be able to bridge 5 years until they really are revenue positive and really are innovating with the product? That's, I think, the bigger risk. You don't end up with something that becomes obsolete.
I do think that's an advantage, though, of a buyout like this, because the parent company may give them that stability and that runway, and the funding they may need to do the R&D to really make that product much better. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, fair point. Obviously, absolutely. That's another way that this consolidation happens. If they got unique technology, then they'd be a candidate for that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So there's our musings on this. I mean, there's no clear answer exactly what the impact will be, but for companies thinking about investing, and probably, just continue to do your due diligence. But the key is not the software. The software is just a tool. The key is understanding how your buyers buy. And that kind of brings us back to this consistent theme that we have with our videos, our podcast, and the book. And we welcome people to subscribe to them. You can do that on YouTube. You can access the podcast at riptidepress.com. And of course, if you go to commonsenserevenuegrowth.com, you can access the book and buy it through Amazon. So we're grateful to have you listen and join us, participate. We'd love to have you read the book. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Ed.
And I'm John, and together we're Common Sense. See you next time.